Norman Oliver was a British UFO investigator for many years. This video is produced from an article he wrote in Amskaya magazine in October 2007. These are his words. 4 or 5 years back, I gave a talk to the British UFO Research Association in London. Come the interval, a young lady came up to me saying she had a strange experience near her home on the borders of Kent and Sussex. The then Bufora head of investigations, Judy Jaffar, was in charge of that meeting, so I passed the young lady over to her to relate her experience. Later, I asked Judy what she had to say. Apparently Judy started to speak to her, but got called away, and when she returned, our experiencer had gone. This annoyed me, because the girl had seemed upset, and had now disappeared completely. I met her again in a very synchronous way. Hurn Farm, near Crowborough in Sussex, is no longer a farm, but has for many years been converted into a small conference centre, with various groups, yoga, spiritualist, reflexography, almost anything out of the ordinary, holding conference weekends. There is a yearly UFO weekend, organised by Alan Hilton. On the Sunday morning of the conference last year, Alan found we were running out of milk for the coffees, and asked me if I'd drive into nearby Crowborough for supplies. He gave me directions to the supermarket, but I couldn't find the one he said. Eventually, after inquiring at a newsagent's, I turned up at another, quite a large one. I was particularly intrigued, since only the entrance and trolleys were above ground. One had to take the lift or walk down the stairs to the supermarket itself. Being a Sunday, it didn't open till 10 a.m. When the doors opened, down I went, found the required milk, put it on the trolley and went to one of the checkouts, only to find the computers had gone offline, and everyone had to wait to pay until they came on again. Whilst waiting, I chatted to a young lady, whose first visit it was, also, since she told me her family had moved to Crowborough a week earlier, from around 10 miles away. She asked if I lived there, and I told her I was speaking at a UFO conference in Hurn Farm, a mile away, and lived in Lincolnshire. She then said she thought she'd recognise me, but wasn't sure. She was the young lady from that Bufora meeting years back. We exchanged contact details, and over the following months were in touch quite a number of times, and indeed still are. She told me what had happened that night and subsequently, and it makes an extremely interesting story, particularly in view of alien contact reports from the same stellar region. Over the last 30 years or so, when checking out UFO and contact claims, I've uncovered quite a few hoaxes, one taking 6 months of spare time in the process, and was actually a hoax perpetrated by senior British investigators, a hoax I exposed fully in 2 issues of the Bufora Journal. I'm convinced Louise was giving me a true experience of her experiences. What is more difficult to tell is whether experiencers themselves might be hoaxed. In past years in the UK, a group of young physicists did just that, and produced a number of well-thought-out and successful hoaxes that on occasion even had Flying Saucer Review completely fooled. I can't see, however, that Louise could possibly have been the subject of something of this description. All else apart, it's too long-running. Also, it's well-nigh impossible for anyone other than a major film or TV producer to organise an apparent visit to a planet in another star system. So, 6 or 7 years back, one summer evening in early September, her first experience, the one she'd intended to relate at that Bufora meeting, occurred one night around 10:30 p.m. when she was returning home. She'd been living in Wadhurst, some 10 miles from Crowborough, with another young lady by car from an evening out in a neighbouring town. The engine stalled, not an uncommon occurrence when cars and UFOs are in the same vicinity, and they'd pulled into the side of the road, which at that time of night was very little used. Louise got out of the car. Her friend stayed at the wheel. She then felt she had to walk into the field, just beyond the point where there were several trees, and realised that 50 feet or so into the adjoining field were several shimmering lights, 6 or 7 feet high, up and down which were running dazzling streaks of blue and red lights she described as miniature coloured lightning. Some 100 yards away, in a field, was what she said was a roughly round hemisphere of similar dazzling streaks of light, which were constantly moving around, but in no set fashion or mode. Though she felt that somehow it was being put into her mind that she should not worry, she was terrified and ran stumbling over the tree roots and long grass in the field, back to the car. A friend had stayed in the car and was calling to her to come back. Although her friend did see lights, they had seemed to be more of the will-o'-the-wisp variety, fireflies. Of course, her vision was blocked out to a large degree by those intervening trees. After a moment the lights disappeared altogether, their engine restarted, and off home they went. It was about 2 months after this that Louise came to the UFO meeting. She did so because 2 weeks later she had been driving along the road again at night and had seen similar lights at this spot, but didn't stop to investigate. She then began to have strange dreams about places which, whilst unknown to her, seemed familiar in some way, and it was then that she decided to tell someone about her experiences, but had backed off at the last minute when Judy Jafar turned to speak to someone else and left the meeting. During the weeks after the meeting, though, she had further dreams, not alarming dreams, but dreams, so to speak, that made her feel receptive to further similar experiences. On a third occasion, her car engine, this time she was again alone, cut out at the same spot, and she was approached from the nearby field by a tall man. Probably due to her dreams, she was unafraid this time, and though keeping the car door locked, wound down the window. The man told her they were visitors from another world, and no harm was intended. They had a special reason why they wanted to contact her. She then got out of the car, and he walked her to a craft in the same field as the lights she'd previously seen, and now just visible in the darkness. Kent countryside can be very dark on a starless, moonless night, as I know from experience. Though he had no torch, her companion seemingly had no difficulty seeing where he was going, and guided her inside it. There were several other men and women inside the craft, and she was invited into a cabin with them. She was then told the lights she'd previously seen were from their craft, and of occupants who had ventured in outside. It was common practice when different crews visited either a planet or an area of a planet they hadn't been to before, to wear protective clothing in the form of force fields. The flashes and lights Louise had seen were such. On the first occasion they also covered the craft. The second time the force fields had been toned down, since no detrimental effects had been observed on the first occasion, and they would not be subsequently used. It was a rule that whilst other craft may have previously visited Earth, even maybe the same general area, this procedure was always adopted with a new crew. It had been suggested to her telepathically, they said, in dreams, subsequent to her first experience, that she should visit the spot again on this particular date. There was nothing to be afraid of, and everything would be made clear. Now Louise had in fact been adopted, though the circumstances had never been fully explained to her, and she had no idea who her actual parents were. The aliens she now met stated she was in fact descended from their own race, and had been seeded on Earth as had others. They didn't elaborate on exactly how this took place. Louise is tallish, around 5'9" in height. The aliens, she said, were of some 6 inches taller, and more or less of a uniform build. They wore what seemed to be 1 or 2-piece garments, similar to trouser suits, for either sex, and whilst they were of one colour, each person wore a different colour. They'd taken her to a cabin with seats and a table. She was unsure what material they were made of, and was not shown any other part of the craft. The craft itself was hemispherical, and with no apparent joints or seams, metallic and around 30 feet across. Other than on the first sighting when the shields were on, she saw no exterior lights. After that first meeting, she had pre-arranged meetings at specific times, both in and out of their craft. They told her they could trace her wherever she was, presumably by some kind of implant, but this was not referred to, and just wanted her basically to update them with occurrences on Earth and answer questions about day-to-day events. They had others in several countries who were doing the same. They mainly spoke in English with Earth people, but could speak other languages, or communicate telepathically. It sounded as though they could well be, so to speak, in charge of us, and might possibly intervene publicly should certain things unspecified occur. Whether these were actions, nuclear wars or whatever on our part, interference by other alien races or natural disasters wasn't specified. Basically, they wanted a more or less monthly update on Earth affairs. Personal names that never seemed to have been used, or if they were, Louise couldn't recall it. At no time was she given the name of her particular alien contact, though. As far as she could tell, it was always the same person she was met by. While others were very similar looking, there were minor differences in features. They told her they came from the Pleiades. This is a star cluster over 400 light-years away. Sources vary between 404 and 410. They're a compact cluster of 7 main stars that are in fact travelling on precisely the same course in our galaxy as is our own solar system, a coincidence in itself. Their magnitudes, degrees of brightness, vary between 4 and 6, 6 being the lowest visible to the naked eye. They are part of the constellation of Taurus the Bull, representing its shoulder, and best seen in northern latitudes between 7 p.m. and midnight from November to February. Greek legend has it that these were 7 sisters who called for help from Zeus when being pursued by the hunter Orion, both Taurus and Orion being prominent in winter skies. They were then turned into white doves and placed in the sky. There's a more recent Native American tale that the Pleiades were 7 youngsters who, on a walk through the sky, lost their way and never made it home, but remained in the sky, staying close together. The 7th sister is hard to see, since she really wants to return to Earth, and her tears dim her lustre. The names of the 7 stars in the Greek legend have been given to these 7 main stars and are Alcyone, Maya, Asterope, itself a double star, Taygeta, Seleno, Electra and Merope. We don't know whether any of these stars have planetary systems, but there is no known reason why they shouldn't. Quotations about them are interesting. From Star Lore of All Ages, published in 1911, we have a quote from William Olcott. In the ages of the world history, they have been admired and critically observed. Great temples have been reared in their honour. Within this group of stars of Pleiades, man has sought to find the very centre of the universe. In 1928, J.F. Rutherford wrote a book, Reconciliation, about God, space and time. He believed that God was confined to a place or location in space, this place being the Pleiades star cluster. Specifically, it was claimed that God existed on or near the largest in that star group, Alcyone. Again, this might equate with the concept of Homo sapiens being seeded from outer space, and that those responsible for their existence of humanity here were the Pleiadians. The Hopi Indians called the Pleiades Chuhocan, home of our ancestors. The Berbers of Morocco claimed paradise lay within the Pleiades star cluster. The Greeks aligned temple with their rising and setting. Pre-Incan legends from Peru refer to gods who visited them from inhabited stars in the Pleiades. And there are numerous other references from around the world to this star cluster having a special significance. Other contact claims with the Pleiades have included those of Eduard Billy Meyer from Henwal in Switzerland, and those of Preston Nichols. Maya claimed to have taken numerous photos of craft and met the commander of one of the ships, a woman by the name of Semyaze. A book, Light Years, was written about Maya's experiences by Gary Kinder. Opinion is divided as to the authenticity of his claims and photos. The late Graham Birdsall was, I know, amongst those who strongly opposed both. However, I could find no major points in anything I've read or seen about it that would actually run counter to what Louise has to say. The other contact claim with the Pleiades was by Preston Nichols, who co-authored the Montauk books with Peter Moon. It's hard to give a précis of Preston's experiences. In his book Encounters in the Pleiades, an inside look into UFOs, he relates how, largely via memory recall and subsequent hypnotic regression, he learned that the Pleiadian civilization goes back over 100,000 years. They originated from what they called the Old Universe and settled into a seven-sister star group we now know as the Pleiades. He was told that there were 6 inhabited planets within that star cluster. 3 populated by humanoid life forms comparable to our own were also comparable to our own development. The 3 others were occupied by beings of pure energy. The 3 humanoid occupied ones were called Arion, Alderon and Aldebaran, the same name incidentally as that of the brightest star in the Taurus constellation, of which the Pleiades are a part. Those names are worth remembering when I come back to Louise's contact. Basically, Preston was told that it was they who seeded the human race. The planet to which the Preston was introduced was Alderon. The people were peace-loving there, and there was barely any crime. The fauna, animal life and atmosphere were very similar to Earth's, but there was a higher oxygen content, up to 30%. Their sun was to within a few million miles of the same distance from their planet as we are from our sun. Structures, dwellings, seemed of rectilinear type, but there were no corners and indeed no joins of any description, and Preston was puzzled at their construction. Some were clearly of stone, others of metal. The Pleiadians, he said, lived to around 1,000 of their years, which equates to some 700 of ours. In the main, they were taller than us, but of more uniform appearance. Most had blonde hair, blue eyes, and their dress was standard, mainly of one particular colour to each person. They conversed both by speech and what was termed a collective consciousness. They were peace-loving, and crime was almost unknown. Specifically, Louise was told they were from a planet circling one of the Pleiades, known to them as Aldina. There were 2 other inhabited planets in the system, called Argan and Aldera. Compare this with Preston Nichols' Alderon, Arion and Aldebaran. Other superior life forms existed on other planets, but these were much more advanced and ethereal. Again compare. Aldina and Arion inhabitants were peaceful, but one, Aldera, had more aggressive races, though not aggressive to their own kind on the other 2 planets, and in fact, on occasion had defended the entire system against exterior attack. This again is prominent in Nichols' account. It's unclear in both cases whether the given names referred to planets of 3 separate stars of the Pleiades or 3 planets circling the same star. When I've been given alien names and places, I've often wondered how the contactee recalled all the details, and more so as to whether their spelling and representation of such names was correct. I found too that if you ask witnesses unexpected questions, it can be helpful in establishing whether or not they might be hoaxing, in part or in whole. There is one rule though, namely that you don't appear to the witness to be at all suspicious of what they're telling you. Though I know quite a few people who've had, in my opinion, genuine abduction experiences, over the years I've caught a few others out in this way. I asked Louise about names and places, and she passed this particular test, telling me that she always kept a small diary with her, and when she began to be given information and names and places, she asked if she could write down notes. She was told she could, but warned not to tell the media anything, saying she wouldn't be believed anyway. I asked her about spelling, and she said that when doubtful she asked and was given what was considered to be an accurate English rendition, since the main Earth language used with contacts was English. This is logical, since it's the most widely spoken language, and would appear reasonable. Other languages, they said, were used on occasion, but English was the preferred option. They would not always arrange for her to meet in the same place, since they might be seen by others if they regularly landed in the same spot, and for the previous 2 years landings and meetings had been in fairly remote areas of the Sussex Downs. These stretch some 70 miles from Beachy Head in the east, where they meet the sea and edge their way inland through the county of Sussex until they reach the next county, Hampshire, 30 miles inland. By now, of course, she'd met with them many times, at intervals of between 1 and 2 months. At first, though, these meetings had been in a clearing in Ashdown Forest, some 7 or 8 miles from Crowborough. Now, having been born in Sussex, 30 miles away in the town of Worthing, only a mile or so from the Downs, I asked where the subsequent meeting places had been. She wouldn't give me the current area, but did give earlier ones. 3 places I was personally familiar with, and at 2 of these, some 30 years back, I'd had unusual tape recordings. These places were Truleigh Hill, Edburton Hill, and an area behind the town of Worthing known as the Long Furlong, together with neighbouring Clapham Woods. Both at Edburton and the Long Furlong in past years on skywatches, I'd recorded words that were baffling. For example, back in the 1970s, with investigator Mark Stenhoff, now in charge of physics at a college in West London, I skywatched at the Long Furlong, maybe not far from where Louise would have had a meeting. I'd brought a portable recorder. Mark had a new unopened tape, and I'd put this on to record 20 yards from our car off a downside track. It recorded for about an hour, whilst we were inside the car. I then stopped it, and it was replayed. Absolutely nothing for 10 minutes. Then a male voice said very distinctly a word, if it was a word, "Shubshi." We could make nothing of this, though researcher Jimmy Goddard later suggested it might be Shioshioi, which in the alleged Solex Mile language means "to the apple we sought we return." Over a mile down the track, it's called Honeysuckle Lane, where Mark Stenhoff and I had the Shubshi occurrence, there was a spot where Louise had her most interesting experience. Now we come to a fairly obvious question, namely, was Louise ever taken to their home planet? The answer is yes, on one occasion. To me, the arrangements themselves were interesting. She was told they could arrange to pick her up and use time manipulation to ensure she arrived back at precisely the same time as she left, but were reluctant to do this since it couldn't be guaranteed that there would be no complications from others. If inadvertently someone else became involved, complications time-wise could be immense and extremely difficult to unravel. They would prefer if she told her parents, with whom she was still living, she would be away for a weekend with a friend for a couple of days. They said she should arrange to leave her car on a downland car park. I'm familiar with this spot myself, and I doubt that there would be any problem leaving a car there for a day or so. The car park is to the west of Sisbury Hill, where there are remains of Roman fortifications. They would then descend on nearby open ground just after dark and pick her up. It's a fact that over the years there have been numerous reports of UFOs descending both over Clapham Woods and nearby Highdown Hill. I have press cuttings of a number of them. She followed their instructions and was picked up. The journey time was minimal, probably closer to Earth minutes rather than hours, despite the 400 light-years distance. Obviously, much of the time, too, was taken up with exiting Earth's vicinity and entering that of Aldina. She wore a wristwatch, which apparently maintained Earth time throughout. One has to remember, too, that as Louise was on their planet for barely 2 of our days, even with the aid of her diary, she couldn't be expected to remember everything, or, for that matter, to ask questions you or I might ask, or to make notes of things you or I might make notes on. Also, it by no means follows that she was shown what was typical of their entire planet. Remember, too, she'd been told that their atmosphere had a higher oxygen content than ours. This would doubtless have been reflected in how she felt. She'd been told also that Aldina's gravity was not greatly different to that of Earth's. Without figures being given, she'd also been told their sun was smaller than ours, but hotter. I found it interesting that the distance of Aldina from its sun was said to be roughly the same as Earth's, particularly since this is precisely what Preston Nichols was told when he wrote about his experiences on Alderaan. It's also interesting that he named the 3 planets all commencing with the letter A, as did Louise. Briefly, these were some of the quite varied recollections, both of which she'd been told at different meetings, and of her short period on their planet, a composite of her various notes and experiences. Other than those on the planet itself, she was unsure exactly what she had been told on what occasion, even with the assistance of her diaries. Remember, she'd had meetings with the Pleiadians on numerous occasions over the previous few years. Here are some of those notes and recollections which I've tried to put into some sort of order. Types of aircraft. There were no types of plane as we know them, but smaller craft similar to the one she'd come on were in use both for local and interplanetary interstellar flight. Most, it seems, regardless of size, were capable of both. She had little to add to her original exterior description of the craft, other than to say when doors slid back after she disembarked, there was no visible joins on the metallic surface of the craft. Food. Basically, this was forms of fruit, vegetables, nuts and similar. They were good to taste, but she couldn't identify any with ours. They did, however, have fish-type delicacies. Eating animal flesh was not forbidden, though few did so. No animals were seen, but she was told that many resembling our deer and similar species were to be found in country areas. No others were specified, though she believes there were others. There were no dogs or cats or indeed any other pet animals to be seen. Moons. There were 2, one natural, one artificial. The artificial one was about 10 miles across. With Louise, incidentally, they used miles, yards and so on, as I imagine they do here. Probably these were metricized or whatever according to the country visited. The natural moon was smaller than ours, but closer. It was seen by Louise. She said it was more orangey red than ours, but quite bright. Seas, oceans. As with Earth, these covered quite a proportion of the planet. Apparently tidal power was used for their energy requirements. Types of dwelling. They were mainly long, terrace-type dwellings, seemingly some sort of stone being used. Everywhere this had a smooth surface. Curves were in evidence rather than straight lines and corners, both interior and exterior. Again, see similarities of the account of Preston Nichols. It seemed that families had 2 or more rooms within these long terraces, but the rooms were large. As with dress, only 1 or maybe 2 colours would be used in wall decoration. She visited several homes, but didn't observe any form of wallpaper or any other form of decoration. But there would be 1 large screen, similar to a flat TV screen set into the walls. This didn't seem to be for entertainment rather than communication purposes. She'd been told telepathy was used, but not to such an extent that it superseded vocal or other forms of communication. There were forms of couches both for daytime and night use. There had been no mention of the length of their day and how time was subdivided, but Louise did rest for an uncertain period whilst on their planet. Music. At times this would come from the walls. This applied both in craft and in homes. It seemed to be background music of a light, soothing nature, and I'd guess it to being of the type that incorporates delta and theta brainwave patterns. Vehicles. Louise only had experience of these on her planetary visit. The craft had landed not at anything similar to an airport, but outside what might be described as a large pod, into which it slowly moved, and they disembarked. Surface travel had been in what one might term streamlined cabins, holding up to 7 or 8 people, which moved as might hovercraft, but silently. She was told that the population was almost universally similar in general appearance, with 1 or 2 unspecified exceptions, though no major racial differences planet-wide, although she met about a dozen people on her trip. These all addressed her in English. When they spoke to one another, which wasn't often, it was in a fluid form of speech she didn't recognise. A form of telepathy seemed to be used much of the time. Indeed, this had been mentioned to her at earlier meetings. At no time was she given names of people, despite their overall likeness. Names didn't seem to matter. Colours, however, did. It would seem they recognised each other by colours, or shades of colours, rather than names. Indeed, she herself remembered individuals she'd met by the name of a colour. This obviously would have problems to us, since there's a pretty limited range of colours. It might be, therefore, that families, indeed races, were clones, but different families of clones were given the name of a different colour, which they wore. Louise had never pursued the question of how they easily identified one another, and I've asked her to raise this point if opportunity so provides in the future. Where they had landed was in a medium-sized town. Exactly what medium-sized was is not specified. The town was on a plain, but there are also numerous mountain systems and countrified areas, as on Earth. Altogether, this is a fair amount of information. Obviously there are areas not covered, since Louise's visits to alien craft have mainly been concerned with her telling them about events rather than the other way round. To my mind, Louise is definitely telling the truth, or as much of the truth as she knows and understands it. I can't confirm what she says by personal experience, though there are peripheral indications of my own involvement. There are too things that seem to have a connection with the entity experiences of my friend Larry Dale in Thailand, also quite possibly with claimed events at Montauk. I would again point to those close coincidences with the experiences of Preston Nichols. Both he and Louise have referred to 3 planets occupied by humanoids, all of not dissimilar names and commencing with the letter A. His description of dwellings is very like that of Louise, and there are often other similarities, including that 1 or more of the other 3 planets are occupied by an advanced, more spiritual type of being. What, if any, further developments there may be is impossible to say at this juncture. A point I would make, though, is that it seems to me that I became a safety valve, so to speak, who Louise could confide in, and it occurred to me this might have been arranged in a circuitous manner, so that Louise stayed on an even keel, so to speak. It's possible, of course, that Louise might eventually decide to write a book and go public, as has contactee Anne Andrews, who together with her son Jason gave a number of talks about their experiences with the Greys in various states of the USA last year. She was much helped by British researcher Tony Dodd in a similar way to my connection with Louise, and Tony would, I feel sure, vouch for the genuineness of Anne's experiences in the same way that I support those of Louise. And of course, by next year, Louise may have further experiences to report. Let's briefly look at these synchronicities. So far, I've had no contact experience, unless one includes such things as the tape voice and a figure of fish-like scales I and my family saw briefly at Avebury Stone Circle. My role, if one may call it that, seems to be somewhat of a go-between between experiences, contactees, and the UFO public. I edited the Journal of the British UFO Research Association for some 36 years in all, giving details of experiences of numerous UFO witnesses, contactees and abductees, many of which I'd researched myself from time to time. I've also brought into prominence other areas, such as tape messages, the Rorty verses, the claimed Montauk events, time lapses, and many other types of phenomena. I've also given numerous radio and TV interviews on all sorts of aspects of UFOs and strange phenomena generally. Indeed, in the last 3 years, I can even claim to have introduced UFO-interested couples who have subsequently married. Probably the most notable example being Janet and Colin Board, who've written about a dozen very popular books on strange phenomena of all descriptions, such as Mysterious Britain, Alien Animals, and Modern Mysteries of the World. I seem therefore to have been a designated part, to be a communicator rather than an experiencer, and indeed this could be said of quite a few other UFO researchers, and certainly including Lucius Farish. The question then arises, though, as to who or what is arranging the designating, which basically says the same question as to who or what is behind abductions, crop circles, cattle mutilations, and numerous other strange phenomena, and what is the overall purpose. These are the synchronicities. I'd first met Louise at a London before a lecture, and then lost track completely. But then 6 years later, a week after her family had moved to Crowborough, I was a speaker at that Horn Farm weekend. Horn Farm being little more than a mile distance. I've been to 8 or 9 of those weekends over the years, but never previously had I been asked to go to the supermarket on the Sunday morning to get milk or anything else. When I went that Sunday morning, it was to a different supermarket than the one I'd been directed to. It was also the first occasion that Louise had been to a supermarket in Crowborough. We both went at the same time, just before the Sunday opening. Had it not been for a computer failure at the checkouts, we would almost certainly have never met and spoken to one another. Now, putting all those things together, it's far more than coincidence, almost indeed more than synchronicity. One cannot but believe that the meeting was arranged by an unknown source, and that at that point I would become more involved with the experiences of Louise, and then make them more generally known, without, at this stage, her identity being made public. There is a second set of synchronicities of meeting places, many of which appear to associate with me as well as Louise. For almost all the places where Louise had contact with the Pleiadians were known to me, and in 1 or 2 cases by name only, but with the rest, such as Truleigh Hill, Long Furlong, Clapham Woods, and indeed the point where she boarded the craft. I'd actually visited them on a number of occasions in earlier years. Indeed, at 2 of them I've been present when voices from an unknown source have been implanted on tape. Within the last 3 months, Louise has moved well away from the south of England and now lives with a relative in Wigan, in the north of England near Manchester. Up to now, she's been directed to at least 1 further meeting. This was at a large hill and heath area 6 or 7 miles from Wigan, known as Winter Hill. Although surrounded by some 4 or 5 towns, it's bleak and deserted. I can say that from personal experience, since 30 years back, with others, I skywatched there several times near its peak, where there's a tall TV mast. In fact, on one occasion, I was with a guy called Reg Chapman, who had 2 contact experiences there. These were with an entity from a horseshoe-shaped craft, and he gave me a unique description of this entity. I've never heard a similar description of an alien, and I doubt that I or anyone else ever will. His exact words to me were, "He was like a Jewish rabbi in the streets of Manchester." The points I'm making are, firstly, that contacts are continuing despite the change of area, some 200 miles from the Sussex downland, and that secondly, just as I knew of the Sussex downland, so I'm familiar with Winter Hill, which brings synchronicity into things even further. Two further personal synchronicities before I close. I spoke some years back on the claimed events at Montauk, which involved both time travel and the Philadelphia experiment. Now, Preston Nichols, with whose description of the Pleiadians Louise's has so many features in common, also featured largely in those events. Not only that, but scientists at Montauk were said to have discovered the Earth's biorhythm period peaked at a specific date each year, August the 12th, with maxima every 20 years. Now, I'd originally taken it for granted that Louise's trip had been at a weekend, but when checking with her recently, she looked in her diary for the exact date and day, and it had been Tuesday, August the 12th, 2003. I then asked if she'd checked any dates of her other meetings had been on August the 12th. Sure enough, the one last year, in fact the one before I met her, had been on August the 12th, 2005. Another synchronicity. A couple of Sunday morning talks I gave 3 or 4 years back concerned the experiences of my friend Larry Dale in Thailand with an alien entity of unknown origin. I referred to earlier experiences and also connection with the Montauk events. Indeed, Larry himself, who has largely approached his experiences from a numerological and mathematical standpoint, has found what he considered to be 10 strong mathematical grounds for connecting me not only with his own experiences, but the Montauk occurrences and the experiences of Louise. I have to admit that though I can follow his numerological associations, and there are many such associations, his math is way beyond me. He also has written a book about his entity experiences, and I understand this will soon be published by Amazon. He has, however, been persuaded to make it a 2-parter, the first detailing his experiences, the second to include his mathematical deductions, since the average layman, myself included, would be extremely hard put to follow the mathematical justifications he presents. I have absolutely no reason to believe Louise's contact was other than a true account of her experiences, as she understands them. One final point I would make, though, is that even if elements of her experiences, of the Montauk events, of Larry Dale's experiences, and so on, were in any way fallacious, the synchronicities would still be there and require explanation.